Hello and welcome to our week on Song of Songs and the Psalms. Today I'm going to be focusing on the Song of Songs. So the origin of the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs, also known as the Song of Solomon or the Canticles, stands out from all other books of the Bible. There's no reference to God or to the Torah. It has a frank but subtle eroticism, and it's a love story between two young people. Traditionally, as you see from the title, it was said to have been written by Solomon. But as you'll see in the book, in chapter 3, chapter 11, chapter 8, Solomon is actually a not very sympathetic character in this story. He stands in contrast to the young lovers who are in nature, and he is in his luxurious palace. It seems to have been written sometime around the 4th century BE, though some scholars date it to a little bit later. It may have been part of some wedding poems, but as you will see, the majority of it is about love outside of marriage. Some of the poetry is bucolic, is out in the countryside, and some of it is urban within the countryside. Rabbi Akiva, who was one of the rabbis who wrote the most about Song of Songs, says that it is the holiest of the holy books of the Bible, and that it should not be studied until one is older. And this was believed by both medieval rabbis and early Christians. It is different than other biblical texts in also other ways, in the sense that women in the Song of Songs are facing down disapproval, seeking out their lovers at night, and really appreciating the erotic love. It is a non-reproductive, focused love. It is focused on female sexual initiative. And the male lover is also vulnerable to love. He yields to it, he's captivated by it, and he really holds the woman up. So it's a very alternative version of love than what we find in most of the Bible, which is more focused on marriage and on reproduction. The Song of Songs also links us to the Garden of Eden, in that it envisions humans as being in a garden of love, and so we sort of have that as a bookend to it. But one of the great questions has also always been, of course, why is it in the Bible, since it does not mention either God or the Torah? So first of all, let's look at some similar texts. As you saw in your textbook reading, there's really no agreement among historians about if the Song of Songs is influenced by these texts, but historians have argued about this before. We don't know much about the origin of Song of Songs. However, there are some similar texts in the area. One of the earliest scholars to study the Song of Songs origins is a 19th century German scholar, Wettstein, and he actually compared it to contemporary folk weddings in Syria, in which songs of praise were sung for the body of both the bride and the groom, for each part of their body, as we will see in Song of Songs, and where also the bride dances, and there is also dancing around the bride and the groom. And so that was the comparison he made, and he saw it therefore as a part of a wedding ceremony. Later on, we have T.J. Meek in the 1920s, who's a Canadian academic who finds parallels with cultic texts from the Canaanite god and goddess Ishtar and Tammuz. And there are hymns sung for them. So every year there would be a ritual for the spring that celebrated their bond. Tammuz would go down into the underworld in the winter and come back up to Ishtar every spring. And with that, he would bring fertility back to the world. So Meek argues that the Canaanite traditions were transformed into monotheistic Yahwist cult. Thus, it makes sense, he argues, that the Song of Songs is read during Passover, as the Canaanites sang their songs in the spring as well. Later scholars also saw remnants of the Sumerian rite of sacred marriage, in which the king, representing the god Dumuzi, would have sex with a priestess representing the goddess of love, Inanna. And she then gives him a blessing and gives him power in war. And that would be the main point of a sacred marriage. So we have fragments of texts of this ceremony, and some of it resembles the Song of Songs. So some of these Sumerian songs also may have been written by women, and we see that the woman's sexuality is as important as the man's. Here on the right, you have a Mesopotamian clay plaque, which dates from about 2000 BCE, which is seen as a representation of the cult of sacred marriage. There are common things that we find in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Song of Songs traditions of love songs. One, the lovers refer to each other as brother and sister. Two, the mothers are the intermediaries for love, and the father is absent. And three, the garden is a prominent place for love. So we see these commonalities in these different love poetry. All right, so how do we read this text? How should we go about reading this? Here I have Chagall's Song of Songs on the right. Well, first of all, as we see with both the Song of Songs and the Psalms, there is parallelism. If you'll remember, parallelism is when you have two lines that somehow match each other in poetry in different ways. And so we find that parallelism, and you should look for it when you are reading the Song of Songs. Sometimes the parallelism in the Song of Songs is looser than that of the Psalms, but it is there. You can look for sort of intensifying of the message, so look for that. Secondly, people have read the Song of Songs both literally and allegorically. The text was most often read allegorically throughout Judaism and Christianity, and it's not until the 18th century that we start to have literal reading of the Song of Songs. All the allegories of the songs rely on the fluidity of love as an emotion that can be experienced in very different realms. It's about the way that one can love God passionately, or Christ passionately, in a way that one would love a lover. So the love of God has that passion, that closeness, that intimacy of lovers. So it's not necessarily about taming the sexuality of the Song of Songs, as some people have argued since, but it's more that people see that the hottest desire you should have is the desire for God. So this love in the Song of Songs is a total love. It's a total commitment. There are no competing suitors. There are no enticing maidens in the vineyards. It is complete and total. This allegorical exegesis, of course, is not new for Jews or Christians. We have allegorical interpretations of the love stories of the gods with the Greeks and Greek antiquity as well. So that's one way of reading, and we'll look into that a little bit more. The second way of reading is the literal reading, and we're going to discuss the literal reading as well. But this centers on the understanding of the sexual nature of the text, right? It is a love story between a man and a woman. So as you're reading, read carefully. This is poetry, and you are going to need a lot of interpretation. Don't try to follow the sequence too much. It's fragmented. Look for metaphors. So for instance, the foxes are womanizers. The vineyard is sexuality. The question we might ask is, does the Song of Songs still have a place as a mystical reading if we also know that its original meaning was sexual? We have to ask ourselves, does the original meaning of a text necessarily stay as its meaning forever? In a sense, this happened to the Song of Songs. It may have begun as a text that was purely about sexual love, but then it was interpreted metaphorically, and now it is often interpreted again literally. Interpretations change with time. So Jewish exegesis. Here is an exegesis from the Song of Songs Rabbah. And the exegete, as you will see here, and as you will be doing in your assignment, takes one line and then gives us an interpretation. Your two breasts are like two fawns. This refers to Moses and Aaron. Just as a woman's breasts are her glory and her ornament, so Moses and Aaron are the glory and ornament of Israel. Just as a woman's breasts are her charm, so Moses and Aaron are the charm of Israel. Just as a woman's breasts are full of milk, so Moses and Aaron are full of Torah. The most extensive Jewish compilation of the Song of Songs is that of this Song of Songs Rabbah that you will look at. And every verse and every single word sometimes is worthy of contemplation. The Jewish exegetes take their cues from the prophets, who, as we saw, develop a relationship between God and the people of Israel as a marital relationship. But while in the prophets, Israel is a woman who has fallen, she's a bad wife sometimes, and it needs to be reprimanded. In this case, the love relationship is a mutual one, it's an egalitarian one, and it's a one in which both parties are truly valued. Traditionally, the Song of Songs is chanted in the synagogue during Passover, and some Sephardic and Hasidic Jews have a custom of reciting it each week on Shabbat evening, as Shabbat service serves as a renewal of the loving vows between God and the Jewish people. So because it is such a mystical text, as I've said, people are not supposed to really read it until they are older, so they are not overwhelmed by its sexuality and sensuality. Christian mystical exegesis, as you can see, this is a very important text. The Song of Songs is the most often used of any Old Testament books by Christians in the Middle Ages. It's the most often preached, it's the most often copied. But this doesn't last. This lasts until about the 17th century. In 1644, Grotius compares it to Greek love lyrics. The Protestants are not fond of it either. They see it as, they see the Bible as something you should read literally, and so they move away from the reading of Song of Songs. But throughout the Middle Ages, it is the most popular text. We have, first of all, Origen of Alexandria in the beginning, in the 3rd century, who sees it, who interprets it, as we talked about, there are different interpretations, 3 interpretations. The literal he sees as being between Solomon and Pharaoh's daughter, the allegorical Christ and the church, and the spiritual God and the individual soul. He recognizes the 3 levels there. Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century, who you will have the opportunity to look at, is a Cistercian. He writes Brides of the Celestial Bedchamber, and he sees it as having 3 levels in terms of mystical union with Christ, right? And those 3 levels are the purgative, the illuminative, and the unitive ways of mystical union. They are stages of Christian perfection. So the purgative is the time when you need to resist. Okay, I'm going to be talking in the dark because the lights went out. Purgative is the time when you need to resist and overcome your sins and passions. You need to keep the commandments and pray. The illuminative is the time when you start to think about union with God. You have spiritual contentment and more time for contemplation with God. And the unitive, finally, is when you are in union with God and an ecstatic mystical state. So he uses the Song of Songs to explain these 3 stages of union with God. And he has the one passage, "Let me kiss him with the kiss of his mouth," right? To describe that, right? So the feet, if you kiss the feet of somebody, you are in the purgative, right? You are just in the beginning of your movement. If you kiss the hands, you are in illuminative. But if you kiss the mouth, then you are in full union. You are in union with God. He talks about spiritual marriage, and a spiritual marriage is one in which there is no inequality. A spiritual marriage is one when you are fully bonded. It is a love that is stronger than a bond between parents and children. And he points out that love is more important than fear or honor, which is what we find in the Song of Songs. So as he says, love is sufficient in itself. There are many other interpretations, but these are 2 of the major people who interpret Song of Songs. Finally, I want to briefly look at feminist interpretations because these are so important. Phyllis Tribble, who I have mentioned before, I believe, wrote God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality in 1978. She's an early critic of both the sexist and the early feminist interpretations of the scriptures. She argues that early feminist movement rejects the scriptures, and in doing so, they accept male chauvinist interpretations. And so they reject all of the scriptures because of that male interpretation. Instead, she takes on the scriptures and interprets them from a feminist viewpoint. In her chapter on Song of Songs in God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality, she sees the Song of Songs as an overturning of the Garden of Eden. It's a new garden of equality and sexual freedom. The woman's curse in Genesis 3, as you remember, subordinated her to the man, but now they are equals. As in Song of Songs 7:10, it says, I am my lover's, and for me is his desire, right? Opposite of what we saw in Genesis 3. So the Shulamite, pictured here, is the second Eve. She has an emphasis on the feminine perspective. She points out that we have the daughters of Jerusalem. We have the mentions of the mother's home, which is very different than the rest of the Bible, where usually we talk about the father's home. A second feminist interpretation is Julia Kristeva, who is a philosopher, a psychoanalyst, and a literary critic. And she sees the Song of Songs as being originally secular. She agrees with that, but she's actually interested in the allegory that arises out of this. And what she's interested in is because of this discussion in the Song of Songs, you have the tension between presence and absence of the lovers, which you'll see, which is so erotic. The desire for union, but also the desire for unfulfilled love. And she sees these as allegorically important when we talk about presence and absence of God, desire for union with God, but desire for unfulfilled love of God. So those are two among many feminist interpretations. I hope you enjoy reading the Song of Songs. It's truly a beautiful text, and I will see you next week. Did I not take